Yeah. So let's start again. Like I said, today we're talking about code switching, and last week we talked about borrowing, and we'll see especially at the end that these two features, these two processes are actually very closely related to each other. And it's important to be able to tell the difference. So let's begin. Today we're going to talk about the different types of code switching. We're going to look at the different functions of code switching, and we're then going to introduce some key studies on code switching. And then we're going to look at code mixing. So we're going to spend quite a lot of time on code switching and then look at code mixing. For the people at home, or the people watching this on their own later on, what you should know is that whenever we watch a video or anything like that, I'm going to press pause from now on. But you can still see the video because of course the links to the video and the links to everything are still in the still in the PowerPoint, but I'm just not going to record that section. Okay, but you can still of course watch the video and you'll know when we're watching it. So what is code switching? So our classic definition of code switching was developed by John Gumpert in 1982. It's the one we've come to use as the definition. It's the juxtaposition within the same speech exchange of passages of speech belonging to two different grammatical systems or subsystems. So by grammatical systems, we mean two different languages, or grammatical subsystems, we mean two different dialects of the same language. Okay, so we have to have these two things being juxtaposed, so next to each other. Another example, another definition that we have is from Heller and Pfaff, and they say that it's the use of more than one linguistic variety. So again, we have the different grammatical systems, but they're not limiting it to two, by a single speaker in the course of a single conversation. We'll just give the people who are arriving 1 minute to get in. And moving on then, another definition from Peter Auer, and Gumpert and Auer are really very central scholars in the field of code switching. So always bear in mind like their definitions. So they say that he says that code switching has and creates communicative and social meaning, and is in need of an interpretation by co-participants as well as analysts. So it's not just that people do it randomly, like there's a meaning behind it and it's motivated by something. And so that's what we are really interested in, because identifying code switching is fairly straightforward. Okay, so we have lots of different types of code switching. So we're going to start firstly with just structural types of code switching. So one structural type of code switching is alternational code switching. And this is when we have alternations between languages in a single utterance. Right, so this is alternational code switching. So alternating between languages in an utterance. So for example, if somebody begins, ich möchte gerne ins Urlaub fahren, but I don't know whether I can afford it right now, we see that they start in one language. Hold on, I want a better pointer. Yeah, we see that they start in one language, German, but then they switch to English. Yeah, so that's what we mean by alternational, because we're alternating between two languages. The other type of code switching that we have is insertional code switching. And insertional code switching involves inserting a single word or phrase. Okay, so you're not switching the entire language. So for example, if somebody says, I want to go in Urlaub, but I don't know if I can afford to gerade, then we just have one or two words. So that's insertional code switching. But very often insertional code switching might be counted as code mixing. So what we're mostly going to be looking at when we look at different types of code switching from a structural point of view is what has been called alternational code switching. Okay. Thank you, Zoom. Insertional code switching, for example, but we'll talk about that very briefly, means that it's structurally integrated from the onset, right? So it's set up in the structure of the language. So if we look in our example here, I want to go into OLAB. Yeah, this structure is already integrated. But you can also have insertional code switching that is not structurally integrated. Okay. So that's the structural types of code switching, yes, alternational and insertional. What we're going to spend a lot more time on is looking at situational code switching, or well, different types of code switching in terms of non-structural things. So the first thing we're going to look at is what Gumpert in 1982 called situational code switching. So situational code switching has to do with when we have a change associated with the interlocutor, context, or topic. And situational code switching can either be between languages or between varieties. Okay, so this is the first place where I'm going to stop recording. And we're going to see first example of switching between languages, so between Spanish and English. And then we're going to see switching between varieties, between Standard English and African American Vernacular English. Okay, and for the people at home, like I said, or the people who are watching this on their own, like I said, I'm going to stop the video while we watch the video. I'm going to stop the recording while we watch the videos, and I will ask somebody who has a very good memory to please, when I say we are continuing, remind me to press play, because this will be for everyone's benefit. Okay, so I'm going to stop this share first, and recording. I'm going to pause recording. And we'll just say very quickly for the people who are watching this at home. So what you should have noticed in the first video is the switching between Spanish and English. And sometimes he says the same thing, like sort of underlining what he said in the first language. So repeating in that way. But in the second one, we have code switching between two varieties of the same language. So we have African American Vernacular English in one sense, and then Standard American English in the other. And the person switches between that. But there's no repetition. We also have the translations into Spanish, but that's probably just something they're doing to like get people rather than a whole, other process that's happening. Okay, so that is situational code switching, right? And when we talk about code switching, we have two terms that we need to remember. And that is the notion of we codes and they codes. So the we code is, for example, in the first video that we saw, yes, the we code, that was clearly some sort of Spanish church, or where there was lots of Spanish identifying people. So the we code is the code that's used to refer respectively to the ethnic minority language of a bilingual community. So it's the local language, it's the minority language. So in the video we looked at, for example, or when we've spoken about the United States in the past, that would be Spanish in the United States. But the example I have here on the slide is also, because we've met this language before, Gujarati in London. Okay, and the they code would be the code of the wider society within which that community forms a minority. So English in London, for example, is the code of the wider society. Standard English in the United States would be the code of the wider society. And of course, we codes and they codes aren't just limited to different languages. They are also they also include then the different dialects, okay, the different varieties of that language. So the we code in the second video would be the African American Vernacular English, and the they code in the second video would still be English, okay, or Standard English. Another type of code switching that we encounter is called conversational code switching. And where situational code switching has an external prompt, like there's a reason for doing it, because if we looked at that definition very quickly, it's related to the interlocutor, so who you're speaking to, or the context, so where you're speaking, or the topic. In conversational code switching, there's no external prompting, so it just sort of happens. So here now we have a video of conversational code switching. This is taken from TikTok, but on YouTube. So again, people at home, I'm pressing pause and you can watch the video on your own. it says on the start back recording now. So yeah, so what you saw there would be both speakers have Spanish and English, or they both speak Spanish and English. So the conversation could have just happened in one language, yeah. And she starts by calling the first one fatty. She says gorda, gorda, so fat girl, basically. And then she switches into English. And then when the other one gets her really dumb answer, she's like, "You're really dumb" in Spanish. And then she says it in English. But there's no really external prompting, like, because they could have just done the conversation in one language since they both speak both languages, yeah. The other type of code switching that we have is called metaphorical code switching. Ignore the things on the right of your screen for 1 second. And metaphorical code switching, the purpose is to evoke connotations that are associated, there's a typo there, with a particular variety. So I'm sure many of you know the song Waka Waka by Shakira. And in that song, we have a nice example of metaphorical code switching, because we see that, I'll tell you what languages and then you can listen for them. She's going to switch between English, and the metaphorical association with that, well, English is the language of pop music. But remember, Waka Waka was made for an international sporting event. We have Fang, which is a Cameroonian language, and the original song Waka Waka, from which parts of this were taken, was written in Fang. It was a Cameroonian song. Then we have Spanish, which is Shakira's L1, so Colombian. So it's also metaphorically marking, okay, yes, she's not Shania Twain or somebody, she's still this Colombian person. And then we have Cameroonian Pidgin. So let's take a listen, and then you can see that very clearly, yeah? Oh, I did not open that link in advance, sorry about that. So hold on. Okay, here we go. Well, I mean, we also have an ad. While the ad loads, I'll stop the recording. The reason I'm right, what's really important about metaphorical code switching is when you listen to the song, for example, yeah, when the whole Samina Mina Zangalawela, I don't have the words in front of me, so I can't say it properly. We don't actually know what that means. And we don't know when the other person sings in Cameroonian Pidgin, when it says, Awela Majoni Biggie Biggie Mama 1A to Z. We don't understand what this means. Bati Tuzala Majoni Biggie Biggie Mama from east to west. We see there's a lot of code switching happening here. Bati Waka Waka Ma Waka Waka. We don't know what any of this means. And maybe some people know what it means, like people who know these languages, but the wider audience for whom this song is written does not know what it means. So really what it's doing is evoking things of, okay, yes, this is the World Cup, that was in Africa, it's time for Africa, and because of that, we're going to have an African language thrown in there. Yeah, but it's not really giving us any informational content. Okay? It's the same thing like the Spanish. She only says "Íbamos por todo," and later on in the song, I think she says one other thing. So it's not really that this is giving us any informational thing. It's really just important that, oh, Shakira is from Colombia. Okay? So even though you have all these other linguistic influences, the most important language, the matrix language, we can say, of the code switching is English, right? English is the language that's being used the most. And all these other languages are just doing sort of signaling, like metaphorical signaling, pointing to important connotations, right? So that's metaphorical code switching. Our 1995 makes two further distinctions when he talks about code switching. He distinguishes between participant-related code switching. So participant-related code switching is dependent on the preferences and competences of a particular participant. So for example, if you're doing group work in a seminar, So even if we say, please do it in English, most of you end up talking German anyway. But let's say there's an exchange student who doesn't speak very much German, then the entire group has to change to English. Okay, so it's because of one participant that this change is made. Okay, because one person can't speak German well enough. So that would be participant related. We can also have discourse related. So discourse related code switching sets up a contrast in which structures some part of the discourse. So for example, it could be to reiterate a point or for emphasis or to show that you're really frustrated with something. So let's say, for example, when I was at school, I had a teacher, and every time she got really exasperated, she would switch into Spanish. So she said, never in my life, nunca en mi vida. Or if you think of that the third video we saw, the TikTok video with the two women, where one of them, she switches into Spanish and she's sort of annoyed. Yeah, we can argue that that's an example again of discourse related, because she's doing it, she might be doing it for emphasis or for utterance. We don't know for sure. Yeah, but we could assume that. Okay. So that would be discourse related. It's something to underline something. Of course, many of these types of code switching are related to each other, right? So it's not just like something is always X or Y, but you always just want to see, well, what's the best explanation I can use, or what two things? Because, for example, discourse related code switching might be very similar to metaphorical code switching, but it's just under a different typology. It's just a different person developed them. Okay. Because, for example, if we have somebody say never in my life, nunca en mi vida, and they're therefore like signaling like, yeah, I'm really frustrated, that would be a metaphorical code switch as well. But it is, in the first instance, we can look at it as discourse related. So I don't want you to think everything is just clear cut. It's either this or this. There are lots of sort of blurry lines within code switching. So those are the different types of code switching. But now when we talk about code switching, it's not as though code switching can just happen. We have constraints on code switching. So we have things that constrain the ways in which code switching takes place. Okay, so the first constraint, and a very important constraint, is the equivalence constraint. And the equivalent constraint says that code switches will tend to occur at points in discourse where the juxtaposition of L1 and L2 elements does not violate a syntactic rule of either language. Okay, so it means, so you might remember from your introductory courses, the whole notion of the underlying structure and the surface structure. And what we need at the point of the code switch is the surface structure to match. Okay, even if the underlying structures are slightly different, the surface structures must be fairly similar in order for the switch to happen. So according to this constraint, a switch is inhibited from occurring within a constituent generated by a rule from one language. So now we're talking about the underlying structure, which is not shared by the other language. So no, I don't have an example there. So we'll go back, far back here to this with our alternational code switching. No, sorry, in the insertional code switching. I want to go into Urlaub. Yeah, we had to get this. It couldn't break the rule of German or English. Yeah, the grammatical structure still has to be in place. So we couldn't say I want to go on Urlaub. Well, you could have said that because it would still fit the surface structure. Okay, so the surface structures must be compatible. If they can't be compatible, the switch can't take place at that specific point. Okay. The other constraint on code switching is that you have a free morpheme constraint, and that means that code switching is prohibited between a free and a bound morpheme. Nicholas Krunker, is your question about the previous point or this point?
My question is about discourse-related code switching, because I wondered, can it also be unintentional? because of some surprise element, for example, or is that something else?
What do you mean by surprise element?
When you said I think it was your teacher who switched to Spanish, that was intentional, wasn't it? So
Yeah.
to bring across that she was very unhappy. Or,
yeah.
But to me, it happened when I did my Erasmus semester in Ireland, that someone talked to me with a very strong Indian accent. And I was so surprised that I switched to German, even though I didn't want to. He talked to me extremely fast and with this extreme accent, and I switched to German and asked, "Was hast du gesagt?" So I wondered if it can also be unintentional, or would that be something else?
I think that's something slightly different because let me think for a second. I think that's something slightly different because there's another thing that can happen when languages come into contact, and that is accommodation. And basically what accommodation theory, so we're just going away from code switching 1 second, but not really too far. So accommodation theory says that we will try to match the language of our interlocutor. Okay, so we will try to sound like people around us when we speak, basically. Yeah. But within accommodation, you can also have divergence, right? So basically, like the best situation of accommodation, we have convergence, so we move towards the language of the other speaker, but we can also have divergence where we move away from the language. And that to me sounds like a case of divergence. Rather, divergence will also result in code switching because now you change the code of the conversation. But I would really relate it to, it could be participant related. Yeah, so you're sort of set off and so you go into that. Or the other thing it could be would be situational. So it's dependent now on the topic or the context. Yeah.
Okay.
So not necessarily discourse related, but I think it would be a nice example or a cleaner example for accommodation. But of course, like I said, all these things are mixed together.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the question. So the first grammatical constraint we had was the equivalence constraint, and we saw that with the structures. The second grammatical constraint we have is the free morpheme constraint. And that means that we cannot have a free morpheme and a bound morpheme. You can't switch between the two, right? So we can't say "good jumping" because we have two bound morphemes there, "g" and "n," and then we have a free morpheme from English "jump," and that's not allowed, right? The exception to this rule, however, is if we have a morpheme that has been integrated phonologically into the language of the other, right? So Googled, for example, we can have that because this free morpheme Google has already been integrated into German, so we can have that. Okay, but typically there is a free morpheme constraint, so you cannot take a free morpheme from one language and then use the bound morphemes from another language unless the sound is integrated phonologically. Okay. The other grammatical constraint on code switching would be what we call the size of the constituent constraint. And that means that higher level constituents, so sentences and clauses, tend to be switched more frequently than lower level constituents. So one word categories such as nouns, determiners, adverbs, verbs, adjectives, those are less likely to be switched than an entire sentence, right? And the exception to this is nouns, because nouns are a bit promiscuous. They're everywhere, they do everything, and they comprise most of the code switches. Okay, but typically we have a size of constituent constraint. And if you then look at constituents then as morphemes, we see that that goes back to this one free morpheme constraint, so that bound morphemes then are really small, they're lower level constituents, and that fits in then nicely to the previous grammatical constraint. Those grammatical constraints, but we also have social factors which can affect code switching. So firstly, we have speaker independent factors. And these are things that are outside of the speaker's control. So economic factors, prestige, power, relations, associations of the variety. So of course, speakers might be aware of this, but it's not up to the individual speaker. It's not a matter of individual speaker competence. That's why we say they are speaker independent. So for example, let's say we meet the President of the United States. Yeah, he is wealthier than we are. He is more prestigious than we are. Well, at least than I am. I don't know your personal economic circumstances. He's more powerful than everybody else. And so because of these things, that's English is going to have a lot of power. So even if we prefer to speak in German, we are going to speak in English to go along with that. But if you also think of things like advertising, you might see sometimes that people write ads with English words, even if they don't understand all those things, because English is seen as a powerful language, it's seen as a prestigious language. It's associated with forward thinking, with being open-minded. Some of those are associations of English. And so lots of advertising companies might use English for their work. Yeah, to sort of be like, yeah, we're associated with this really powerful language variety. But those things are really independent of the speaker, but speakers will still go along with it. The other thing, of course, it can work in the other direction. So speakers might stop speaking Gujarati if they're in one context because it might be associated with not being educated, or they might not speak standard. African-American speakers might choose not to speak African-American vernacular English in some context because people might associate it, for example, with lack of education or criminality or other things like that. And so people don't want to be associated like that. So they go along with these associations and then avoid that language by switching into standard English. Okay, but those are things that are external to the speaker in the sense that they belong to the whole society, and the speaker then makes that choice. Okay, but it's not dependent on the speaker. The dependent aspect, now when we talk of speaker dependent factors, that has to do with things like group membership, competence in the variety, individual language attitudes and ideologies, and perception of self and others. So let's go back then to our African-American vernacular English speaker. If, for example, being African-American and their perception of self as an African-American is really important to them, that person might choose to not switch to standard English, might choose to keep speaking African-American vernacular English, even if they speak independent factors, like even if, let's say, they're in a place like, I don't know, a job interview or somewhere where the power relations might require them to change or might expect them to change, and they say, no, but my identity is too important to me. So that's like speaker dependent factors. Or let's look at, if we look at Spanish English speakers, some people might just not be able to speak English, or Gujarati speakers in London, especially older generations, especially women in older generations, they might have reduced competence in English, so they just can't do it. Yeah. Or like you might have people who just think, yeah, no, if we have a multilingual society, for example, where English is increasing with power, like because it's becoming more and more prevalent, some people might say, no, I personally am not going to do that. So they might refuse to speak the language. So that would be a factor that's dependent on the speakers. Okay, so those will be factors that are dependent on the speakers. And then we have the factors that arise within the conversation itself. So within an individual conversation, what do people think is important? What are the things that are happening? So sort of being that language choice and the code that people use is negotiated within the conversation. Okay? Those are the factors. And then what we have related to these factors would be something like reasons for code switching. Okay, so let's say, for example, we have the first example we have here is switching for reported speech. So let's say we are speaking to somebody about something that, again, let's say the President of the United States says, and we were first speaking German, so we said, ja, und dann sagte er, and then we don't say, ja, und dann sagte er das, er fand das dumm, or something like that. We'll say, oh, und dann sagte er that he trusts what the jury says, even though he's disappointed with the result. Yeah, so it's reported speech, so, or we say I then, so we start in one language, but then we switch the language in which the original speaker spoke. So that would be switching for reported speech. We might switch for address the specification. So let's see if we imagine that our, let's say we've gone to the Mensa with several people and we were speaking English before because we were trying to include a specific person. So that would be address the specification, but we might also switch back to German if we just want to ask one person something. Yeah, so you can have it like that as well. And then the other thing we can do is we can switch for clarification or emphasis or expressivity. So that was the example that I gave you before with nunca en la vida or nunca en mi vida. So you have, yeah, we're switching for emphasis. Or we might switch for clarification. So let's say, I mean, I would not do this, but let's say you were in a geography course and the course was happening in English mostly. So the course was being taught in English and there was something that was really important that the lecturer wants you to understand. They might switch over to German to make sure that people really understood the point. Okay. Yeah, so that would be for clarification. Then we have message qualification. So message qualification is if you want to separate facts from content. So if we say, yeah, so, you know, 30% of people are still not vaccinated, that's fact. And then if I say, aber das bin ich wirklich dumm, that's comment. Yeah, so if I separate those things, so I'm giving facts in one language, comment. And so really sort of separating, yeah, like almost professional from personal. So there's all those types of ways you can look at it. Yeah, and that then mixes with the next point, contrasting personal with objective viewpoint. Yeah, it's very much related. Yeah, so these will be your reasons for code switching. Okay. When we talk about code switching, give me 1 second. Yeah, when we talk about code switching and borrowing, so we've had borrowing before, and it's important for us to be able to tell the difference between the both, because both of them involve two languages. Yes. So with code switching, so everything you see on the left of your screen towards the code switching side, that it's more likely to be code switching. Towards the right of your screen, it's more likely to be borrowing. There are, of course, there's a huge gray area, like you see this area here where the this area here, that's the gray area. Okay, so please don't think it's just, yeah, one thing or the other. But let's start. So bilinguality. So when you have a bilingual speaker making the switch, it's more likely to be code switching. If you have a monolingual speaker making switch, it's more likely to be borrowing, because remember we said last week that with borrowing, people can borrow words even if they don't actually know the language. Yeah. So that, like restaurant, you might use restaurant and not know French. So then it's likely to be borrowing. If it's a whole phrase or an utterance, it's more likely to be code switching. If it's a single word, it's probably borrowing. However, if thinking now, we're still on, so we don't want this to be like single word, definitely borrowing, phrase, definitely code switching. Because if it's a default expression like c'est la vie, then it's probably still borrowing, okay? But if it's a special conversational effect like nunca en mi vida, then it's probably code switching, okay? Because it's not a phrase that has been like regularized in the language, in English that English normally uses. So it's not functional in English in that way. Then we have specificity. And I'm going to stop share for 1 second because I can't see my notes on specificity and I want to be able to see them. So I'm going to share this with you instead. Okay. Okay, yeah. Current slide. I can't do both at the same time, so I bust there. 1 second. Blah, blah. Right, so specificity has to do with the fact that on current slide. So if somebody borrows a whole lexical item, if it's a whole lexical item that's used, then it's probably code switching. But if it's paralexical, so paralexical is a word that's being used to describe something, but it's like now integrated into the language, but except it happens usually with bilingual speakers. And with that, what we have is paralexical items. So for example, if, let's say we have Syrian refugees now in Germany. If a child who's a Syrian refugee begins calling their grandmother Oma, or you might hear, you often hear Turkish people, for example, on the phone in Germany, and they'll be speaking in Turkish, but then they say Bahnhof. That's an example of borrowing, and it's paralexical, okay? Yeah. Then we have the regularity of the situation. So if something happens just once, then, so it's a single occurrence, then we say it's code switching. Yeah. But if it happens all the time, then it would be borrowing. Yeah. So if it's regular, it's probably borrowing. So that's why we could say that Bahnhof in Turkish German speakers is an example of borrowing, of paralexical borrowing, because it's pointing to a specific thing. Structural integration, and we're going to, you might remember structural integration, sorry, from last week when we talked about the nouns, the words, sorry, that are borrowed into English. So words like psalm, how they don't have ps because it's not psalm. So when we have structural integration, we have borrowing. And if it's not structurally integrated, then we have code switching. Tina Zambli.
Yes, I have a question in regards to this regularity. How can this be described? How often?
Yeah, that's a great question. Basically, we don't know. But if it's like the most important, if it's something is the better side to err on is to look at if it's a single occurrence. So if it's a single occurrence, it means like, okay, let's say I forget the word for, let's say I'm speaking to a friend in English, in German, and I forget the word for coaster. Yeah. So that's Untersetzer, but let's pretend I forgot the word for coaster. And I say, ja, and so I say, ja, und es war wirklich ärgerlich, weil die Geschenke waren alle da und wir hatten keinen coasters. Yeah, so it was annoying because the drinks were there on the table and there weren't any coasters. Yeah, that just happens once. But other people, and that's why you want to look at all these other things together, because other people don't regularly use the word coaster. They would just use Untersetzer. Yeah, so it's not regular in that sense. if other people start using it, if we can look in other conversations and we're not seeing this coaster thing, then we can assume it's a single occurrence. Yeah, but it is very hard to look at, and it is very hard to say, okay, once it happens 10 times, then it's not code switching anymore, it's borrowing. So yeah, it's a very gray line, and that's why we have this, that's why I pointed out this gray area issue. Okay, but it's an excellent question. Okay, we talked about the operationality and we talked about structural integration, and then we have operationality, which has to do with core vocabulary. So if it's a core vocabulary item that's being borrowed, then it's probably code switching. Oh, sorry, that's being used, it's code switching. And with operationality, what you might find is grammatical operations, and that's more likely to be borrowing. Okay, so now what I would like to do with you is, for the rest of the session, I would like to talk about some important studies on code switching. Okay, so one of the first studies on code switching, or the first one that really influenced the idea of code switching, was done by Blom and Gumpert in 1976 and then in 1982 as well. And it was done in Hemnesberget in Norway, and it involved 2 languages. Okay, the first one was Randamal, and Randamal was a Northern Norwegian dialect, and Bokmål, which was a standard dialect, usually acquired in school. So I'm going to stop the share very briefly here. For the people watching this on their own, you can do the Kahoot on your own, but I'm going to stop the recording and then resume it. No, I'm not going to stop the recording. That doesn't make sense, because then you'll miss the comments. So yeah, it'll just take a while then to upload afterwards. Okay, so Kahoot. Just give me 1 second. I can move Shakira because there are too many things open. So classic. And now, so we're gonna talk a bit about that one. The Kahoot, you need to go to the and enter the pin. If 2 people decide they don't want to do it, it's not that hard. So yeah. Okay, so I'll put back music now. Okay, other people, you can join as we continue, because the code is always there. Yeah, so this is me bringing things back from before. Sorry about that. Yeah, because we said one was the standard variety and one was the local dialect. So they're in a diglossia relationship. Yeah, that we learned that from a few weeks ago. So yeah, that was a kind of a main question, but it was just to remind you that that's also part of the situation. Yeah, that the things aren't always separate. So LD is in the lead. Let's move on. Oh, no, sorry, you are correct. I don't know what happened there, but that should be, yeah, it should have been situational code switching. I don't know why I put the wrong answer, but you're absolutely correct, situational code. So that I'm really sorry, because that means nobody got any points. But it shouldn't affect the ranking, but you are definitely correct. The correct answer is situational code switching. Sorry about that. That was my error. Oh, and that is also true of how language is used there. Yeah, it's situational as well. Oh, right, sorry, no, sorry. You just have to guess, sorry. I'll show you the data after. I have to stop there because I went one question too far ahead. We'll come back to the Chinese grammar. Yeah, so just to go back to the Norway people. So yes, Ranamal and Bokmal, they are in a diglossic relationship. That information that you saw, so we said Ranamal shows local identity, shows community membership. And therefore the answer in the Kahoot was not wrong. So when people are in the town meeting, or it could be that there are two things happening there. So when they're in the town meeting and they're doing chit chat in Ranamal, it's metaphorical in that they're showing community membership, yes? Because remember, we said metaphorical code switching has to do with connotations of the language. So they're showing community membership. But we also have situational code switching, huh? Yeah, that was the issue there. Because when the context changes, so when it goes to important business, then it moves over to Bokmal, yeah, to the standard dialect. And so it's in that case, it's also situational. But yeah, it's metaphorical in the sense that the Ranamal for the chit chat shows, yes, we're all part of the same community. And it's so when the teachers then use Bokmal for their actual lectures, what they're doing, or for their actual class lessons, what they're doing is saying, okay, the situation now is a class lesson, and when we're not in a class lesson, we're doing something else. Okay, so that was that. For Tyneside, that was a second study. So that's one study, Ranamal, Bokmal, Blom and Gumpert, sorry, remember that, and the relationship between those two. So in the Milroy, what Milroy and Leeway did is they did a study on Chinese English code switching in Tyneside. And I remember we've seen this study before, because remember we looked at it when we looked at language shift. So which generation was speaking what language. So the study isn't new to you because we did it with language shift and language change. And basically what they found was that there's code switching across the generations. So they found that Chinese was used by grandparents with one another, and the grandchildren use English with one another. So what that means is that, so you just had the question, and lots of people assumed they would have the same weak code, which was fair enough because I showed you the slide too late, but they don't share the same weak code because the grandparents are using Chinese, specifically Mandarin, with each other. So they have one weak code, and the grandchildren have a different weak code. Yeah, the grandchildren don't share their grandparents' weak code. Yeah. And so that's how the language shift now is affecting the type of code switching that can take place. Yeah, that's all I really want to say about that. So then we have one last question from the Kahoot. So now we go back to the Kahoot. Da, 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 da. But I have to share the screen. Yeah, so like we said, they are not sharing a weak code, yeah, because the Chinese grandparents are doing one language and the children are another language. And the last question. Yeah, it's participant related because they start their answer in English when they're speaking to their grandparents, and then they switch to Chinese. So they're doing it because they're speaking to their grandparents. It's not conversational because remember we said conversational doesn't have to have any external influence, and in this case it's because they're speaking to their grandparents. Yeah, it's one of those gray areas between code switching and code mixing, but it's a stronger example of code switching. Okay, so stop that share. So yeah, again, those examples are real. So we have that. So you should make notes then of that type of code switching with the grandparents and the grandchildren. What I would like to do now is if you can go to the Moodle under the session for code switching, there's a handout. So if you can open that handout, because this is the last example we're going to look at for code switching. Am I still recording? Yes, I am. Okay, so this handout is taken from Andrew Stopoulos 2015, and his study was on, I can share that very quickly with you, so you have it for your notes. So he looked at Greek German teenagers on Facebook. And I want to look at the handout and make notes of in the chat. Actually, no, I've changed my mind. Can you make notes in the Etherpad? Because the Etherpad has already been set up. So on what languages are used and what scripts are used. Okay. So I'm gonna stop the share. Everyone should now have the handout. Yeah, but I'll share my handout for people who from a phone or something like that. This is what we're looking at. Yeah. Okay, so, and you see that we have, yeah, so we want to look at the languages, and yeah, just, you can make your comments based on what you see in terms of the scripts. So just go to the large lecture summary. It's obviously not part of the lecture summary per se, but we'll add it at the top then. I'm going to put it at the top. Andrew Stopoulos. Yeah, and we just, yeah, just write whatever you can think of for that. Are there any questions? Because I'm not seeing any writing. Or maybe I need to refresh my screen before I make statements. Yeah, no, I'm not seeing any writing. So are there any questions? Are you clear on what you need to be doing? Okay, somebody has written German and Greek. Are those the only languages that are used? Look at the handout carefully. The study deals with German and Greek youth, but are those the only languages that are used? And if not, just add it to the chat. Add it to the thing. Yeah, good. So there's also English. What scripts are used? Yeah, so they appear to be using Roman letters. But let's see if that happens everywhere. I think in the extract I gave you it. No, look. Yeah, there's one thing at the start that's somewhere else, but everything else, you're right, happens in the Roman script. Yeah. So let's look very quickly at the handout together, because there are some things I want to point out to you. Firstly, here, I mean, we have things that Andropoulos doesn't identify that I would have identified, for example. So, hold on, let's see if I can draw on this. No, I can't. So sorry, yeah, this English abbreviation, for example, that's also worked into it. We also have what we talked about the structural things of borrowing. So we start here in German. Sorry, we start here in Greek. They start here in Greek. Then we have this code switch into something that's sort of established in English, the name of the series, Vampire Diaries. And then they switch to German, and it's the whole structure. And it happens at a point structurally in the sentence where the structures of the languages allow that. Yeah, the structures of the surface structures allow that. And then it changes completely to German. Yeah. So you can see here the structural elements that take place. Yeah. And then you have, again, this sort of borrowing. Like, I would argue here that what we have here is really borrowing, because yeah, it seems to be like worked into it. But note that again, it's where structurally it can happen. So you have the German determiner, yeah, the possessive determiner, but then you have this happening because like you can have a noun after a possessive determiner. Okay, so we always have to fix that inset. The structure is always there. Yeah. And then, yeah, so you can see that. So this is just an example of that, showing that the code switching then doesn't only happen in conversation. It's not just something that happens in speech. Code switching can also happen in writing. Okay, and there's a lot of that online. There's a lot of that in social media. Facebook is not the only place. You can see a lot of it on Twitter. Anywhere where there's writing, there's probably code switching happening in on social media. So it's actually it's not just restricted to conversations in that sense. Okay, so the last few minutes, I just want to look now at code mixing. So code mixing has to do with language mixing within a phrase or an utterance. And that's the definition given by Lynn and Ansaldo. And what code mixing results in is what we might call fused lex. So fused lex are combinations of structures from different languages, which no longer have any particular conversation structuring function. So when we saw the code switching before, it was conversation structuring. So we saw that they went order of us, yeah, we saw that the conversation was structured, and you can say, okay, this is Greek, this is German, this is English, and that's not what happens with code mixing. Instead, the whole mixing, the whole thing is meaningful, and using this lect, like using this sort of mixed language, then is meaningful as an aspect of group identity or as a mode of conversation. Okay, so it's different from code switching. And that's why the example that you had before with the Chinese grandchildren who say yes or no and then switch into Chinese, those are not code mixing. Those are code switching, because it's like, it's not that they're always using the two languages, so you can't really tell one is ending and one is beginning. And Kanaraja introduces a really nice concept, I think, for dealing with code mixing. He calls it plurilingual competence. And so that's the ability to use different languages at the same time. So you're sort of mixing them together. So we look a bit closer at plurilingual competence in terms of code mixing. So in plurilingual competence, the speakers can have separate proficiencies for each language. And we come back here to a notion that we met earlier in the semester, the notion of repertoire, because a repertoire is the most important issue in plurilingual competence, right? Because remember, we said repertoire consists of all the languages that a person has available to them, right? And so the plurilingual competence results then in the different languages and how these languages are integrated into the person's competence, language competence altogether. In plurilingual competence, people do not have to be proficient in each language, right? Or equally proficient in each language. So you can speak a bit of this, a bit of that, a bit of that. Remember our notion that we met earlier of truncated repertoire. So when a person can only speak enough German to do X and enough Turkish to do Y and enough Gujarati to do Z, that would be your truncated repertoire. We met that earlier in the semester. And in plurilingual competence, it's basically drawing on that idea, saying that, yeah, well, people don't have to be equally competent or equally proficient in each language. People can therefore use distinct languages for specific purposes, the same like we saw with truncated repertoires. And language competence is related to social practice and intercultural competence. Okay, so it happens in the society, and it's part of knowing what to use with whom in what situation. Plurilingual competence, as a result, is not developed formally, it's developed informally, it's developed in the families. It's not something you learn in school. And that's why you might not have the same level of proficiency. That's why you might only be able to talk about a very limited range of topics in one language. But it's very closely related to the notion of mixed languages, because when we have speakers with the same repertoire in their plurilingual competence, we can end up with mixed languages being formed, right? Oh, sorry, with code mixing happening, right? Another element that happens with code mixing, and I think that happens, is the notion of mixed languages. Yeah, so mixed language is a language where whole component parts are distinct from language families or branches, right? So you have different languages coming together, but you can't really tell anymore, okay, this is borrowed from French or this is borrowed from that, like, and it's this language borrowing from this, but they're truly mixed languages. And so we have 3 examples of classic mixed languages. The first is Michif, and Michif is a language spoken in Canada. And in Michif, we have Cree verbs. So the Cree people are people of Canada, but French nouns. And so we can't really say it's code switching when somebody's speaking Michif, because they're using, so they might, if they want to say, I want to go swimming, they will say, I want to go to the pool, they will say, I want to go in the Cree verbs, but to the pool in the French nouns. Okay, so it's not really, and that's the whole language. The language is made up of these 2 languages. Another example of a mixed language would be Sri Lankan Malay. So you have a Malay lexicon, so Malay vocabulary, but it belongs to the Sinhala Tamil in terms of the typology, in terms of the grammar of the language, and that is spoken in Sri Lanka. And then we have Taglish in the Philippines, which is a mix between Tagalog, which is spoken in the Philippines, and English. Okay, so we're going to look a bit more at Taglish because it's a language that's mixed with English. Okay, and like I said, it's spoken in the Philippines and it's a mix of Tagalog and English. And this is might be how it might look, right? So the first sentence at the top is the Taglish sentence. Kumain tayo sa Wendy's. That will be Tagalog. Sorry, that will be Tagalog sentence, yeah? Kumain tayo sa Wendy's. Yeah, in English, that would be let's eat at Wendy's. Okay, Wendy's is the name of the restaurant, so Wendy's is not really important, even though it's an English word. We're really interested in kumain tayo sa. Okay, so in English, it's let's eat at Wendy's. Yeah, when it becomes Taglish, you have eat, tayo sa, Wendy's. So the English verb, eat, but then we have the let's, like let us do this together, tayo sa, and then Wendy's. Okay, so that's how the mixed languages work. You have both things coming together. So it's not completely Tagalog, it's not completely English. It's a new code, this mixed language. Another example would be natapos mo nabayung katadang lin mo. So that will be Tagalog. Yeah. In English, it would be have you finished your homework? Okay. And now in Taglish, we have the English verb finished and the English noun homework. Nabayung would be the have you, and mo is the question particle. Okay, and so we now have this Tagalog sentence that is, yeah, so no, sorry, Taglish sentence that's a mix then of Tagalog and English, and both of them are together. So again, it's not code mix, it's not code switching, because if it were code switching, it might just be natapo nabayung homework mo or something like that. Yeah, it would just be 1 or 2 words. But here it's not, and it's not borrowing. We have this whole new mixed language being formed. So we don't actually have time to do the summary on the Etherpad today. I mean, you can go to it and do it if you please. If you find it helpful, because it's there, it exists for everyone. But I'm going to end here for today, unless there are any questions. Svetlana?
Do we have to remember exactly these examples of mixed languages, or do we need for our exam?
I mean,
for example, when we have to maybe possibly, yeah, we can have to provide example. Can be some other example, or should be one of English code?
I mean, it should be a mixed language that exists. But
not with English, or it should be English.
It doesn't matter. It should just be an existing mixed language. Yeah, I mean, I obviously won't ask anything in the exam that I haven't taught, but I'm not trying to teach just for the exam. So yeah, like you should just you should assume that the things that I teach, I think are important and necessary. And I think they are good examples because I always try to choose like what languages I think are the strongest examples of things in general, not just for this. But I like, because I notice a lot of you like to ask on the chat as well, is this in the exam? My aim is not just for you to pass an exam. My aim is for you to know about language contact and language change. And yeah, and so I will teach things, and yes, I will test the things I teach, but part of it is also like your responsibility to sift the information and try to understand that. So that's just not just for this question, that's just for all the exam related questions. Like I'm not teaching for an exam, I'm teaching for you to understand these concepts. Yeah.
I really like your lecture because I'm actually planning to work more on language contact. I'm actually more concentrated on Slavic languages. There is a lot of code mixing and languages mixed existing. For example, I come from Ukraine, and I could say that my native language is actually not Ukrainian, but Surzhyk. Surzhyk, that is a mixed language with Ukrainian and Russian. But as you said, it is officially mixed language, and yeah, this feature exists. And most of people in Ukraine actually use this language and not Ukrainian.
Okay, yeah, so that's a good example of that. Yeah. Are there any other questions? But thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed the course. But yeah, that's a good example of that. Are there any other questions related to today's lecture? You will see then on the Moodle, I've uploaded a quiz that's related both to contact and borrowing. So it's one quiz for the two topics, because of course, planning the quizzes takes sometimes a bit of time. Okay, so if there are no questions, then like I said, feel free to enter the things into the Etherpad because it's there, it's already structured, so you could enter it at your own time. It might be helpful to you later on in your revision. I could just offer that. Yeah, and if not, I will see you next week. Oh, what I did want to say is that I am giving a guest lecture tomorrow at 2 p.m. at the University of Hamburg, but it will be online. So if anyone is interested in attending that, and it's on English in West Africa and the Caribbean and comparing agreement systems. So if anyone is interested in that, let me know and I can organize for you to be sent the link. You'd have to send me an email, but it shouldn't be a problem and I can send you the link. Yeah, so thank you very much and I will see you next week. Janetta, you have a question?
Yes, I have a personal question. I wanted to apply for the Transatlantic Ruhr Fellowship for next year.
Okay, give me 1 second. Let me see what the other person wants and I'll come back to you, okay? And then we can speak properly. How can I help you? Okay, no, that person is gone. Okay, yeah, go ahead now.
Maybe I can turn off my turn on my camera now.
Yeah.
I wanted to apply for the Transatlantic Ruhr Fellowship, and for my application documents, I need a letter of recommendation by one of my lecturers, and I wanted to ask if you do things like that.
Yeah, that's not a problem. What you would need to send me, when do you need this by?
It says, I don't know, one page on the website says 10th of December. The other one says end of December. I don't know which one is true.
It's fine. So send me, if you just send me an email with the information about what the program is. And sometimes they have a form. Very often there's a form that we need to fill out. But if there isn't a form, they often have like some sort of directions for people doing recommendations. Once you send that to me, it shouldn't be a problem.
Okay.
I'll be very happy.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask because I had like 3 courses of I went to 3 courses now of yours, Sounds and English in the USA, and I just wanted to ask if you do this.
Yeah, that's no problem.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Bye.
Bye.